All right, hello everybody. Welcome back, and congratulations on not getting scared away after week one. It looks like most of you didn't experience too many problems getting your assignments submitted. I was really pleased with how they all came out. So great job, keep it up. I was also shocked by how many of you have not seen any of the Star Wars movies. I mean, it's they're movies about space samurai wielding laser swords. I don't know what entertainment preferences you possess that you aren't having them gratified by this. But anyway, we digress. Also, only a few of us gamers out there. It's just so lonely. Anyway, but I did hear The Last of Us, which is a great game. And then also I heard one of you mention League of Legends, too. My cousin is actually an esports caster for League of Legends. He's called Doa, so if you follow that scene, maybe you're familiar with him. But anyway, we digress. Let me start off with some good news for you this week. There is going to be no quiz this week. In lieu of a quiz, we're going to be participating in a little bit of research. I'm going to be getting a link from the scientists, and I'll make sure to send it out to you, to everybody. Your participation is required for this, but it should only take about 15 minutes, and it's just an online survey. It'll be really quick. All right, let's get going. Let's start with a little bit of a recap from last week. First, we talked about what exactly it is that we're researching when we research communication. We looked at Laswell's 5 factors. We established some definitions for what communication is. Then we looked at some of the ways that we go about researching communication. We looked at some of the methods for making these inquiries, like surveys and lab experiments and content analyses and that sort of thing. We also looked at how we think about these things theoretically. We took a peek at how path models work, talked about mediating variables and moderating variables, and direct and indirect variables. And then finally, we took a look at the early history of communication. We looked at magic bullet theory and why this was an expectation of early scholars. And we also took a look at some of the first early challenges to magic bullet theory. And the big one, of course, was War of the Worlds. And that was because it didn't produce a uniform effect amongst the population. So that's where we left off, right? So now we're in this state where communication scholars are in a bit of a bind. They're a little bit, they're kind of in a crisis, I guess you could say. Some of them just went off the deep end, right? And when magic bullet theory didn't pan out, they just started to figure, well, maybe communication just does nothing at all, right? And they believed that any type of communication was basically going to have no effect on what a person thought or how a person behaved. Now, they might have written a lot about that, but I find that the idea that they actually believed this to be pretty I'm skeptical of it, because if they didn't think communication did anything, then why did they bother writing any of this down? Why did they talk about it? If they really thought communication was useless, they would have all taken oaths of silence and wouldn't have bothered to publish ever again. Maybe some of them did, and that's why their perspective disappeared. But either way, the idea that communication does nothing is even wronger than magic bullet theory is, which says communication via the media is the most important thing in the entire universe, right? It's highly important. It's just not as strong as they were initially suggesting. So the larger resolution started to come when people started to think about communication through the lens of psychology. And what they basically found was that some communication has large effects for some people. Some communication has small effects for some people. And it all depends on what exactly is going on. So in order to really start studying it, they were going to need to start to develop some actual theoretical paradigms. The first large-scale communication theory, I would argue anyway, was called social cognitive theory, or SCT, and it's an extremely useful little theory. It grew out of social learning theory, which you might be familiar with, especially since so many of you are elementary ed scholars, which was also strange. How did I end up with so many seniors and elementary ed people? Anyway, SLT was a really pioneering idea. You see, up to that point, people had tended to believe in this thing called catharsis when it came to violence. The idea was that catharsis would be when you watch a violent act or commit even a violent act in a safe environment, that would allow you to vent your aggression, vent your frustration, and keep it from being inside of you. And then that way, you wouldn't be more aggressive in general. You'd have redirected your aggression. This is actually an ancient Greek idea, and they really based a lot of their society off of this idea of catharsis, right? They had this festival. Maybe you've heard of it. Have you heard of the Festival of Dionysus? Basically, what it was this week-long drunken orgy that ended with all the women in the city running naked into the woods, finding a deer and tearing it apart with their bare hands and eating it raw, right? And the idea was that if everyone vented all their sexual desires and all of their hedonistic desires and all of their violent tendencies in one big go, then they'd be able to control themselves for the whole rest of the year. So in other words, they were especially interested in, for as offensive as this is to us now, that they were interested in keeping women docile. So they encouraged them to basically be feral during this festival. So really, we're talking about an idea here, catharsis, that's thousands of years old, and people have bought into this notion well into the 20th century. This idea that by seeing violence, we get less violent. Then along comes this guy named Bandura to challenge this whole notion. Bandura thought that maybe watching violence would actually make people more violent, not less. His reason for thinking this was just to consider how people learn, right? We watch other people do things, and we tend to learn about the world that way. So he designed a little lab experiment to test this hypothesis. Let's watch that lab experiment right now.
The segment you're about to see is taken from an early experiment on learning of aggressive styles of behavior through modeling. Children watched a filmed adult perform novel aggressive acts toward a inflated doll, and the physical aggression was accompanied by novel hostile remarks. We later measured how much of this modeled aggression the children had learned just by watching. Now, the measurement of learning of aggression uses simulated targets rather than live ones. For example, to test how well bombardiers have learned bombing strategies, you would use simulated targets rather than require them to bomb San Francisco or New York. The model pummeled the doll with a mallet, flung it in the air, kicked it repeatedly, threw it down and beat it. It was once widely believed that seeing others vent aggression would drain the viewer's aggressive drive. As you can see, exposure to aggressive modeling is hardly cathartic. Exposure to aggressive modeling increased attraction to guns, even though it was never modeled. Guns had less appeal to children who had no exposure to the aggressive modeling. The children also picked up the novel hostile language.
Cool, right? I mean, those kids went full psychopath on that inflatable clown.
Let the bodies hit the floor. Let the bodies hit the floor. Let the bodies hit the
Anyway, that basically killed catharsis, right? In the face of that experiment, it was pretty hard to maintain this idea that we vent our frustrations harmlessly by watching violence. It seemed quite the opposite was true, and this finding really led to some interesting thoughts about how we consider media. Right, the basic model then for social cognitive theory is that there's this thing called triadic reciprocal causation. Basically, what it means is that you've got behavior, you've got personal characteristics, you've got environmental factors, and they all work together to influence the next thought or action, right? The way that we've behaved in the past or the way that we tend to behave. Personal characteristics, am I generally an aggressive person? What is it that I believe? What values do I hold? Environmental factors, right? How am I being guided in this particular circumstance? All of these things work together and play together in order for us to make determinations about how we're going to act and think. We can do this because there are four factors that are unique to humanity. First off, humanity has a symbolizing capacity. What that means is that we are capable of using things that represent other things, and we form our communication around them. Words, for example, are symbols. I say the word dog, and the word dog is not fundamentally linked to the animal, the dog. That's why, there's a bunch of different names for dog, canis, and that sort of thing, right? You can call different languages have different words for dog, and none of them is fundamentally a dog. It's just a symbol that we've chosen to represent that object. So humans have that capacity. We have a self-regulatory capacity, right? We're capable of motivating ourselves. We can build up a desire to do something, even if it's actually something we don't want to do. We can fire ourselves up to do it. We have a self-reflective capacity, right? We're able to verify and test our thoughts. We're able to look at our actions and analyze them and say, okay, was that a good idea? Was that a bad idea? Is this line of thought that I'm on good or bad? And then we have a vicarious capacity, right? We're able to learn without direct experience. We can learn by seeing other people do things. Now, for communication scholars, obviously, there's a lot of really useful stuff in here, right? The symbolizing capacity by itself, I mean, is basically all rhetoric. It's an incredibly huge field. The ones that are particularly interesting for us in our class right now would definitely be the self-reflective capacity and the vicarious capacity, right? We learn by observation. We establish expected outcomes, and when those outcomes are confirmed, our thoughts and actions mold to conform them, right? So if I see on television a lot of violence, for example, I'll gradually start to think of the world maybe as a more violent type of place, right? I can look at what other people are experiencing and imagine myself in those situations. Think about how I might respond to them. And then if I ever do encounter them in real life, that confirms it and reinforces my thoughts and behaviors. So the most obvious version of all this would be called modeled behavior or modeling. Modeling occurs when we reproduce a behavior that we've observed, right? And so there's a number of things that are necessary for us to be able to do this, and we do it all the time. Sometimes it's more obvious than others, like with my little girls, right? If I stroke my chin a couple of times, I can make my little girls stroke their chin, right? They won't realize that what they're doing or why they're doing it. They're doing it because they see me doing it, and so it must be something that we do. But of course, it's not just limited to children. We all model behavior, right? If we see someone, especially when we're uncertain about how we're supposed to be acting, if there's uncertainty, then we're really going to model behavior and tend to try to copy the people who are around us. Now, there are four antecedents, I would say, to modeling behavior. So first off, you have to be paying attention, right? You can't model behavior that you haven't noticed. You have to remember what happened so that you can model it. You have to be physically capable of reproducing it, right? My daughter, I was doing some landscaping work the other day, and I was toting around the wheelbarrow. It was full of mulch. And my daughter was watching me do this, and then she got very interested in it, right? So she was paying attention, and she could remember what happened. And so she went over and she grabbed that wheelbarrow, but she wasn't strong enough to lift it with all of that stuff in it. So she wasn't quite physically capable of reproducing it. And you have to be motivated to do so for some reason. Sometimes that motivation can be something as simple as fitting in, but it could be a lot of things. It could just be circumstances. So anyway, modeling doesn't need to be specific. Modeling can be general, right? You don't need to model the exact behavior that you just witnessed. You remember with the Bandura experiment that we were just watching, the kids did not see the researcher use the gun, but it fit into the paradigm of violence towards Bobo. So they were modeling her behavior. It was just an abstract kind of modeling. So in media studies, then, the question of concern becomes, what are people going to actually model after viewing a particular piece of media? We know from the refutation of magic bullet theory that media effects are generally not huge. But what if media has millions of small effects? Typically, older scientists will view things like violent movies or violent video games, and they're going to say, that these things almost certainly lend themselves towards people being more aggressive. Younger scientists, and I would count myself in this crew, typically say that the data actually paint a very different picture, that these media forms have very little effect and very little enduring effect. We'd also say, for example, that aggression is not the same thing as violence. And so don't think that while I'm talking about this, I'm necessarily trying to lead you down a path where you would be saying media is evil and violence is manipulating our minds, right? I don't think that media has the capacity to, really manipulate a person's mind. But that being said, there are some things here that are worth consideration. There's some things here that are worth attention. There's a well-established theory called priming, which effectively states that I can make you think and act in a particular manner as long as I properly cue you. So, for example, let's say I say yellow, 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 yellow. Okay, name a fruit. Right. Most likely, you're going to say banana. Actually, you're probably not, because you know what I'm trying to do, and so you're going to actively resist it. But the first fruit that's going to pop into your mind is almost certainly going to be a banana. That's priming, right? We have mentally associated thoughts and ideas that influence one another, right? Incidentally, by the way, that's called the storage battery model. There's another one called storage bin model where I would say blue, green, purple, red, yellow, name a fruit. And because yellow was the most recent one, banana is more likely to be the name of the fruit. So, if I can do that, what happens if I prime violence instead? What if I do it a lot over a long period of time? So, thinking about that then, make a little note right now, because this is going to be the first part for your video response this week. Do you think that concern over the content of violent movies and violent video games is justified, especially to the degree that there's concern? Do you think that there should be legislation concerning the violent content of video games or movies? And why or why not? Okay, so that's part one of your video response this week. We'll have a little bit more a little bit later. So anyway, as we were saying, SCT, obviously pretty foundational for communication studies. It sets up why people are affected by media at all. We're going to take another look at a theory here. It's called agenda setting theory. Agenda setting theory takes this and really takes it to the next level. Now, we're going to talk about agenda setting theory, but I want you to promise me that you won't go all kooky conspiracy theory with this. Don't become conspiracy theorists, all right? This is a scientific theory that's used to describe a reciprocal effect between audiences and media outlets. It can be very easy to hear this and start to get paranoid about dark, evil masters sitting in closed rooms determining our thoughts, okay? Don't think that way. Hear out agenda setting first, okay? So agenda setting theory posits that the media is capable of determining the salience of various issues to the public. So, for example, the election that we're all enduring right now, a number of issues have arisen that the media has focused on. You've got immigration, you've got transsexual bathroom access, and these issues have received a lot of coverage. Now, I find actually those issues interesting because I don't think for too many people these are the most important issues facing America today, right? Like if I were to ask 50 people what the most important thing a president will have to deal with, I doubt anyone is going to answer bathroom access to me. But if I were to ask what some major political issues are right now, I bet that bathroom access would come up pretty high on the list. And that's the difference between salience and importance, right? Something might not be important to you, but if there's been tons of exposure to it, it means it'll crop up early when you're thinking about things. It'll be something that's really salient. It comes to mind quickly. Agenda setting then would say that the media determines what is salient, and it does so by featuring it more. It maybe features it more prominently, right? If an issue is on page 1 of a newspaper, it'll be more important than something that's on page 18, right? If you dedicate a lot of time or dedicate a lot of space, that's going to make it more salient. Now, like I said before, this all does sound a little bit nefarious, you know. It makes it sound like there's shadowy elite figures sitting in smoke-filled, darkened rooms plotting how they want the public to think. But actually, I actually think it's a far more systemic problem, if you want to call it a problem. I think it's a far more systemic media effect. You see, the media is kind of obsessed in most instances with making sure that they are not those evil, masterminds, right? We have gatekeepers in the media, right? There are people who determine, in many respects, what it is that runs and what it is that doesn't run. But by and large, they aren't, going through story by story and making determinations. They set up very broad rules, and computers kind of take care of the rest, right? These media outlets are almost always constantly gauging the public. They're trying to find out what it is that's important to people. And then they provide content that the people are interested in hearing about, right? So it starts off all very democratic, right? But then you end up with some problems, right? So take like Kim Kardashian, for example. Just a few years ago, she was not a thing. But then somehow she managed to get a story run about her, right? And people saw this story. And so she became slightly more salient. And then the media noticed, because it's constantly gauging the public. Oh, this person, Kim Kardashian, people are starting to become interested in her. Let's run a couple stories about her. So they ran some more stories about her. And then people saw that there were these stories about Kim Kardashian, so she became more salient to the public. And then the media noticed that she was more salient, so they ran more stories. And you end up with this cycle that's very, very hard to break. You guys might be too young to remember this, but exactly the same sort of thing happened with a person named Paris Hilton. Right? She was basically a celebrity just for being a celebrity. Her celebrity kind of came out of nowhere for this exact same reason. Constant coverage. It was exactly the same thing as Kim Kardashian, right? She was inescapable. There was constant coverage of her, and it only finally ended when you had anchor people and newsrooms basically revolting and say, we are not going to cover this person anymore. Now, when they said this, when people started saying, forget it, we're not running any more stories about this person, like most people cheered, right? I cheered. I was so relieved to not have to deal with constantly hearing about every bit of her minutia, right? However, in doing so, they kind of became the thing the media hates, right? These were people who unilaterally decided what the public should and should not hear about. So there you've got it. It's a catch-22. If you have democracy in media, you're going to have Kim Kardashian because of agenda setting. If you don't want Kardashians, then you're going to have media overlords who decide what information should reach your ears and what shouldn't, and you're still going to be influenced by that, right? Then they're just going to be deciding what it is that you think should be salient, what it is that they think, rather, should be salient to you. That takes us to the second part of your video response for this week. What issue for this current election do you believe the media has made the most salient? And does this issue differ from the issue that you consider to be most important? All right, so let's finish up today by talking about framing. Agenda setting theory effectively states that the media determines what we think about. Framing theory goes a step further. Framing theory says that the media determines how we think about things. You see, there's this problem that the media has, in addition to some other things. That problem is words mean things, right? We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later this semester. We'll touch on semiotics a little bit. But basically, there is no such thing as neutral language. Neutral language does not exist. All words have connotations. There is no such thing as a truly impartial relaying of information. The words that you pick are by necessity loaded, and they're chosen to the exclusion of other words. That means that even if you have the sincerest desire to not communicate a view on something, even if you don't have a personal view on something, the mere act of talking about it will communicate a view. It will communicate a perspective because you have to use words to describe it, and those words mean things. Now, most of the time, this slides by us, right? It only becomes obvious to us when we have the ability to compare and contrast frames. So here's an example then, right? This is from a story about people who were taking supplies from grocery stores during Hurricane Katrina a number of years ago. The two articles are basically identical, but in the one featuring white people, it describes their activity as finding supplies, and then in the one that features a black man, he's described as looting the supplies. Now, in some respects, these two words describe exactly the same occurrence, but the word looting is decidedly more negatively charged than the word finding. And this is just an obvious occurrence. Imagine that all the news organizations sat down and said, okay, we're going to describe this behavior as looting no matter who is doing it and no matter for what reason. Now, the rest of the country would read about rampant looting in New Orleans and say, well, that hurricane may as well be a plague from God in response to these thieves living down there. Describing it as finding would cause people to think about it in a totally different way. Describing it as collecting would cause you to think about it another way. The frame would cause us to think about the event in a particular fashion. All right, that's it for the video portion of this week, and that's basically what I'd like for you to have in your heads as you do your reading for this week. Again, I would like to underscore the readings are very important for this class. In these lectures, I do not cover a lot of stuff that is highly relevant, so you're definitely going to want to make sure that you go through the PowerPoints and get notes on everything that is in yellow. Especially pay attention to things like lists and definitions. Those are the things that are most likely to come up on quizzes and the things I'm most likely to be looking for in your final paper at the end of the semester. All right, don't forget to do your video responses. Feel free to email me with any questions or issues you might have, and I will see you next week.